Loud. So we are very fortunate to have Malcolm Singer with us today, who will be speaking about the long professional and personal relations between Ernest Bloch and Yehudi Menuhin. Uh, Malcolm Singer, well known as a composer, conductor, and educator. He was director of music at the Yehudi Menuhin School for 19 years, and musical director of the Zimmel Choir, as we heard a moment ago, for 10 years until 1993. He teaches composition at the Guildhall School of Music and Drama. And Malcolm, I will hand it over to you if you'd like to share your screen. And I believe everyone is already muted.
Right, well, lovely to see you all, and thank you so much for coming. I hope you can see that lovely picture of Menuhin and Bloch. I'm a bit intimidated now I know all about you, and I come to you not as a musicologist, but very much as a performing musician. The reason this talk has kind of come about was because down the years I got to know Yehudi Menuhin pretty well, and when it was his centenary in 2016, I gave a talk at Limud in the UK about, it was called Yehudi Menuhin, Jewish musician, and it was about Menuhin and his connections with Judaism and Israel. And in that talk, I showed a little bit of film of him talking about Bloch. And so Geraldine snapped up the idea that I should give you all a talk about Menuhin and Bloch. And I also spoke to Menuhin quite a bit about Bloch. I'll come on to that later. So it's a very, very personal talk. And although I might be classed as a composer and a conductor and an educator, I'm certainly not a musicologist. So I've had to do quite a lot of research for the other bits of this talk. But this lovely picture you see in front of you, which Lucien will know all about, sat outside my office. I was director of music at the school for 19 years, and that sat outside my office. That's always been on display next to the picture of Menuhin with Elgar. Another famous picture when Elgar conducted, Menuhin playing the Elgar concerto. Menuhin felt very close to a number of composers, and as we'll learn today, Bloch was really, really important to him. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about me and my connection to Menuhin and my connection to Bloch. I suppose as a little boy, Menuhin was one of these gods who I would hear on records on the old 78 vinyl. And then I was lucky enough to go and watch perform in the Albert Hall, never thinking I'd get to know him or work with him. But I was studying with Nadir Boulanger in Paris, and I think he came over in 1977 with his Bath Festival Chamber Orchestra. So I met him then at Boulanger's apartment. And then as I finished studying with her, I started teaching at the school in 77. I didn't really know Menuhin very well, but in 1980, I left the school to go and study at Stanford in California. And my last week of the school, Yehudi happened to be at school. He asked me what I was doing, and I said I was going to Stanford. And he said, are you there the first week in September? Because I'm conducting the opening concert of the new concert hall, the Louise M. Davies Hall. Come to the rehearsals and come to the opening concert. He was incredibly generous, so I did that, which was wonderful. And I only mention that in that his parents were still alive, so I actually met his parents backstage in the Louise M. Davies Hall. That would have been September 1980. I then toured with him in 1986. At the Schleswig-Holstein Festival, the Menuhin School were playing A Piece of Mine, and so I traveled around North Germany with him, and then we did the concert in Gstaad, so I spent quite a lot of time with him then. And then I taught again at the school for a second time, left the school again because I was too busy with my other work, and then in 1998 came back as director of music, and the last year of his life I was working very closely with him and talked to him a great deal about a great number of things. One of which was Ernest Bloch. And the thing I missed out in that little resume was that 1995, when he conducted the Bloch Sacred Service in St. Paul's Cathedral, and you'll see some pictures of that which Judy took a little bit later on in the talk. And Geraldine, who is responsible for all of this, sadly not with us this afternoon, Geraldine had been trying to organize for a performance of the Sacred Service in St. Paul's Cathedral at the time that I was Director of Music at Zemmel. And for various reasons, and I was at Director of Music 83 to 93, but it was a kind of her and my baby, this project to do the Sacred Service in St. Paul's Cathedral. And we had the idea of writing to Menuhin, asking him if he'd be the patron of the concert and come to it. And he wrote back and said, "No, I won't be the patron. I want to conduct it, and I don't want any fee." Once he said he was going to conduct it, of course, we sold out St. Paul's Cathedral, and the Duke of Edinburgh came as the patron, and it was a very, very special occasion. And Geraldine, being Geraldine and very clever, said, "Oh, well, Malcolm, you're not going to conduct it, but we'll commission a piece from you." So I wrote a piece for triple choir that was sung at the beginning of the concert, and there were one or two other things in the concert, and then the rest of the program was the Sacred Service. But I kind of get ahead of myself. We'll come back to that event a little bit later in the talk. As a boy, I had known Bloch's music. I'd obviously known Nigun as a young violinist, and when I was conducting the Zemmel choir, as Robert Max said, I did a 10-year stint. We sang the meditation, Yehudi Menuhin, from the Sacred Service in many, many concerts. So I must have conducted that little meditation dozens of times. The Zemmel choir is a concert choir, not a synagogue choir. It's a Jewish choir performing Jewish music, but it's a concert choir. And we also did the Sacred Service. So I conducted the whole of the Sacred Service in York Minster, as you'll see on this sheet here, in 1980. And at least one other time, I can't remember exactly, Judy or Geraldine will probably remember, but certainly a performance I remember with Brian Kesselman as the cantor in Middlesex New Synagogue in Wembley in London, and I think probably another performance. So I'd conducted the Sacred Service a bit, and I then worked at it with Yehudi for that 1995 performance. When I became Director of Music at the Menuhin School, I certainly conducted both Concerto Grossi. I can't remember when, and my assistant there has been looking back through the archives and can't find out when, but I know both the Concerto Grossi extremely well, and I'm pretty sure I conducted one of them at Menuhin's Festival in Gstaad. And I did, in 2007, make an arrangement of Nigun for a string orchestra, which we performed, first of all, with the wonderful violinist Dora Schwarzburg, although it's been done many times since, and we'll hear a little bit of that later on. So those are my kind of associations with Menuhin and with Bloch, and so it's a very personal talk rather than an academic talk. However, I've been going through the wonderful Lewinsky-Dijon books, and I've been rereading Yehudi's biography and autobiography, and the wonderful Bloch studies, and I've kind of had great fun preparing this talk and learning a lot more about Bloch and a lot of things I didn't know. I quote Bloch in 3 of my pieces in the opening of the Abodah, because I have 3 pieces that I call my Menuhin works. A Hopeful Place, 1996, was written for Yehudi's 80th birthday. He conducted it in the Albert Hall. There was a string octet from the Menuhin School, about 300 kids from local primary schools, and the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra. And since that was his 80th birthday piece, I quote the opening of Abodah in that. And then at his funeral, he is buried at the Menuhin School, and the headmaster and I, as Director of Music, had to kind of organize his funeral, which was what I call a Jewish funeral, with Kaddish being said, but and a rabbi present, but on a very, very liberal kind of service, but quite a bit of music in it. And I wrote a solo violin piece, an elegy for solo violin, actually all on the G string. And again, I quote Abodah in that. And then 7 years later, when we opened the Menuhin Hall, which we raised a lot of money for after he died, and we built a concert hall, I wrote a piece called Opening Rites, which was the opening concert for this hall, and we'll hear a little bit of that later on, and I quote Abodah again there. So I have what I call my Menuhin works, which link me very strongly with Bloch and this beautiful opening of Aboda, which, as Alex Knapp taught me a long time ago, is actually not Bloch at all, but this is what he copied out of the Jewish Encyclopedia, and and then Bloch did the wonderful arrangement and piano version arrangement of Aboda. But I just quote that opening chant. When we look at Menuhin, we'll see later he did some wonderful, wonderful recordings of Bloch. And there's a lovely quote from Yehudi. He says, Bloch was his first composer and I was his last performer, which is a lovely, lovely little quote, because the first piece written for Yehudi, dedicated to Yehudi, was Aboda. And he says in this little bit of film I'm going to show you in a moment that he was 7 at the time, but actually, if you do the maths, he was 13 at the time. And then Yehudi commissioned the violin suites, and the second violin suite was the last piece that Bloch completed. So that's why he was my first composer and I was his last performer. Let's skip a little bit, and I'll come back to that. Let's hear. So Bruno Mont-Saint-Jean, who made a wonderful film about Yehudi called Violin of the Century, which is a very long film, where he talks to the 80-year-old Yehudi about his life, and they watch lots of bits of film of Yehudi playing at different times. So it's a wonderful film showing Yehudi right through his life playing. Well, there were bits, even though it's a very long film, there were more bits that didn't make it into the film. And there's this incredible box set, which is enormous here, of everything that Yehudi ever recorded, audio or video. And it was his centenary, that was published. And within that is this little interview with Menuhin about Bloch. So let's listen to that. So we hear it first of all from Menuhin himself. This is at his beautiful villa in Greece. It takes a little while to get started.
There's a chapter I would like to examine with you, which is the one of the composers that you have met, yes, with whom you have worked, from whom you have commissioned pieces, and of course there are many, many of them. But who was the very first composer that you met?
The very first composer was Ernest Bloch, and that again was kind of symbolic, because it was one of the last composers of whom I'd commissioned, just before he died, 2 solo sonatas. And the first composer who dedicated a piece to me, I'd met him a few weeks before in San Francisco. He was in charge of the San Francisco Conservatory of Music, lived in San Francisco, and I'd met him at an evening that was arranged by the first violist of the San Francisco Orchestra, a man called Lichtenstein, very sweet man who gave me my first mute, a very beautifully carved out black ebony mute, I remember. And Bloch was there, and he asked me to play, and Bloch liked it. And then a few days later, there was a knock at a door around 10 o'clock in the morning at 1043 Steiner Street, where we lived. And I was about 7, I suppose. And that was Bloch, coming with the Aboda, ink barely dry, to Yehudi Menuhin. Well, I'd never had any piece dedicated to me, let alone by a great composer. And therefore Bloch remained the image of a great composer for me, you know, like the first live thing that a duck sees when it's born becomes its mother. And if by any chance it's an old man, that is its mother. So that for me, Bloch remained the composer. And it was a very great moment, and I played it, and then I played it a great deal in my programs. And we remained very close friends throughout his life. We met several times in Paris. In Ville d'Avray, he came and played his Jewish service at the piano and singing all the voices, Enesco and my parents and sisters and I, with Bloch at the piano, hanging over him, and Enesco transported, thinking, a very great work, a very great composer. It was an afternoon in Ville d'Avray. It could only have been in the 32, 33, some around that time, 34. And of course, Bloch had worked very closely with Edmond Flegg, and who wrote the script to Macbeth, Bloch's opera, which was done in Milan some years ago again. And of course, Edmond Flegg wrote the script to Enesco's Oedipus. And so Edmond Flegg was the meeting point between a wonderful man, a great poet, a great writer, a great Jew, and all his family were exterminated. But when he came back to Paris after the war, of course, he reclaimed his lovely old apartment, Rue Quai aux Fleurs, lovely position just behind Notre Dame. Bloch was a very entertaining character because he never stopped talking, and whatever he said was interesting. And he looked like a prophet from the Old Testament. He was a good photographer and used the early Leicas, the miniature cameras, which he took along every year to Switzerland, where he was born. He was a Swiss. He was from Geneva, and came back with these wonderful portraits of this prophet against a mountain, you know, or atop a mountain against the sky. Very dramatic photographs. And
there's one that he took of you, actually.
yes, that's right. That's right. And then when I played his concerto and went over it with him, I said, and the second movement, which is very haunting, very, very mystical, very otherworldly, beginning. And I said, where is that? That's Red Indian, he said.
So, so we heard all about the violin concerto from, was it Joshua, the last session? But it's nice to hear Yehudi talking about it as well. So Yehudi gets his years a bit mixed up. So it was 1929 when, or 28 in December when Abodah was written. December the 4th, Bloch says he wrote it. I've done a timeline here, which I hope is more or less correct. I want to go back a little bit further before we start talking about that, because both Bloch and Menuhin's teacher in San Francisco, Louis Persinger, both studied with Isai in Brussels. So Persinger was the concertmaster of the San Francisco Symphony when Bloch was the head of the San Francisco Conservatory. So Bloch was there, I think, 1925 to 30. One of the musicologists will correct me, but I think that's right. How he started the conservatory is really quite interesting, but that's another lecture altogether, which I'd love Alex to give at some point, because there's really interesting history about that. Anyway, I've been trying to find out whether Persinger was Jewish. I don't think he was. He was born in Colorado, but he got to study in Europe and, as I say, studied with Isai. So there was that link between Isai and Bloch. But if you think about it, the Baal Shem Suite was written in 1923. And in 1926, Yehudi, age 10, is playing it all around the world. So whether that piece became internationally famous overnight and was being performed by lots and lots of violinists, or whether Persinger had actually got it from Bloch or because he knew Bloch, I don't know the connections. Certainly Yehudi's early performances were deeply, deeply moving. And this young 10-year-old playing Baal Shem Suite was obviously one of his real party pieces. And Nigun was often an encore piece that he was playing in those early recitals. But this is... Menuhin is already performing the Baal Shem Suite before he meets Bloch. And there is this picture which I assume is Yehudi aged about 10, 9 or 10, with Baal Shem Suite on his music stand in the background. I can't remember for the life of me where I got this picture from, so I haven't been able to trace it. I found it somewhere when I was giving my Menuhin lecture, and I've taken it from there, but I don't know where I got it from. But it's a beautiful picture of the young Yehudi, and but actually, I'd just like to go back even before that, because the Lewinsky-Dijon book tells us that Cantor Rinder, who we heard about last week, who was in the last session that Jesse did, that we heard about him helping Bloch with the sacred service, very instrumental in the sacred service being written and helping him with the Hebrew. Cantor Rinder was in San Francisco and knew the Menuhin family well. So Yehudi's father, Moshe, was the administrator of the Jewish schools in the Bay Area. That was his job. The Menuhin family were not religious, and those of you who've heard my Menuhin talk, I've talked quite a lot about his childhood, but they were culturally very involved with the community. And Cantor Rinder heard Yehudi aged, I don't know, 2.5 or something, and discovered that he had this wonderful singing voice and could sing perfectly in tune and probably had perfect pitch, and said to the parents, maybe you should get him an instrument. Well, I didn't know this story until I found it when I was researching this. Actually, I went back to the Menuhin biography, and it is mentioned just in passing, Cantor Rinder. Cantor Rinder is interesting because the English people here today will know Robert Rinder, who's a judge, who's kind of the equivalent of Judge Judy on television in England, who's a wonderful judge, and rediscovering his Jewish roots. I don't know if he's the same family as Cantor Rinder or not, but it'd be interesting to find out. Cantor Rinder was obviously an incredibly influential figure in San Francisco, and the Menuhin family would have known him well. And then when Yehudi famously fell out with his very first violin teacher, who was not kind of good enough for him, the Cantor Rinder said, well, and Yehudi, the little boy who'd been to see the San Francisco Symphony Orchestra and said, I want to study with that man, pointing at the concertmeister. Cantor Rinder organized for Persinger to take on Yehudi, because Persinger was always being introduced to these child prodigies and was never interested in really taking them. But once he heard the young Yehudi, he took him on and became his teacher. So there were these links between the Menuhin family and Cantor Rinder and Persinger that were all happening before Menuhin met Bloch or Bloch met Menuhin. And I'm sure there's more research to be done into that in San Francisco about those influences. But Cantor Rinder was kind of obviously a linchpin who was very, very important in a lot of this. Yehudi was actually born in New York, and the family moved out to San Francisco just a few months after he was born, and that's where his father got that job, and that's the background. But you'll see from what I say there, in 1926, Yehudi, aged 10, was playing the Vidui movement from Baal Shem in the Manhattan Opera House. So his first big concert in New York with Persinger at the piano. This little boy was already playing Bloch's music that had only been written 3 years before, which I find really quite extraordinary. And according to the Lewinsky-Dijon, Bloch actually probably heard Menuhin playing with the San Francisco Symphony Orchestra in February 28, although they're not clear, no one's clear about that. But when we heard that story that Yehudi said he met him at that party, which is, Yehudi's recollections are sometimes a little bit vague, but that may well be true. Certainly, it was composed on December the 4th, and Menuhin plays Nigun on December the 5th in San Francisco, and Bloch certainly hears that, and that's the first concert that Yehudi gave on his new Guarnerius, which he had for the rest of his life. And then Yehudi premieres Abodah in Los Angeles on December the 16th as an encore in that concert, and then in January, just a few weeks later, January 29, he plays it as an encore. Also, he plays it in Carnegie Hall. And in 29, he records a nigun with Persinger, and we'll hear that. We'll hear that a little bit later on. I think this has gone wrong here now. I think March the 30th, he plays Bloch hears Menuhin play Abodah for the first time, not nigun. And then there's a famous time when Yehudi goes to Germany for the first time, and his father insists that nigun is in the program in his German concerts. And his first concert is in Munich, and Munich is already a rather anti-Semitic city, and the impresarios are very keen that he shouldn't play Bloch, and Moishe insists that his young son is going to play nigun. So nigun was played, and apparently the audience loved it and went wild and was very, very enthusiastic. Let's hear a bit more music before we go back to my timeline. So this is recorded in 39. This is Yehudi playing Abodah with Henrik Ent at the piano, and we won't hear all of it, but we'll hear a good portion of it if you'd like to hear it. I'm sadly going to try and stop it there. Oh, stop it there, not because it's not wonderful. Well, you can find that recording on YouTube, on the internet. And for me, that's some of the most beautiful violin playing you could ever wish to hear. Yehudi always talks about the violin being right next to the neck. It's just the extension of the voice, and you can really feel that in his playing of that, I think. I hope you could all hear that okay. Put something in the chat if you have any problems or questions. But otherwise, I will carry on. There's something in the chat. That's right. Yes, he was 23 years old. Someone said, yeah, when he made this recording. Now, just to show you, this is my piece, The Opening Rites, how I used Aboda in the piece. So this is the Menuhin Hall, and I wrote this piece for all the string students in the school in 2006 when the hall opened. In fact, this is a performance in 2013. And this little section builds up a whole series of quotes. So the cellos and basses are playing a quote from my elegy, and the violins, who are all round the audience in the aisles, and the violas are up above the stage, the violins around, the older violins, are playing the Bartók solo sonata, which Yehudi also commissioned. So they're playing a version of that, which I've made. And then the cellists come in with the Bloch, as you'll hear, and then the whole of the orchestra plays Bloch, just in this little section. So you've just heard the melody about Bodart, and you'll hear it in this now. The cellos playing Aboda.
No, I've got it. I can't hear you. What are you telling me?
To change that next. That's the first day that Elena's in.
Right.
I will guarantee I'll be able to take you, or
Okay.
indeed,
Okay, then tomorrow.
you know,
Robert,
bring you down to pick it up again.
Robert, you're not muted.
Yeah, I can't always check with you because we're not always there.
Well,
But-
you knew I was down here.
Yeah,
Hey.
I'm not always there.
Robert, Brody, and Linda, you're not muted.
I would say so.
That's all right. So going back to my timeline, as Robert Max has pointed out, Yehudi was 23 when he recorded that in 1939. So there was a lot of contact between Bloch and the Menuhins, and I would have thought that Bloch and the Menuhin's parents had a pretty similar relationship with Judaism. Certainly in the Menuhin family, it was a cultural one, and actually quite against the actual synagogue and the organized religion. I would have thought as European musicians or European intellectuals in San Francisco, they would have been pretty close and shared similar views. So there was a lot of contact between the families and these performances. Yehudi's account of the trip to Ville d'Avray is in 1931, apparently Ionesco and Fleck was there. Yehudi told me this story. He just told me that they rushed across Paris to Bloch's house to hear it. That's the way he told it to me. But I think Bloch probably knows better, and that they actually Bloch went to Ville d'Avray, which is just in the outskirts of Paris, where the Menuhins spent the European summer generally in those years. Ionesco was Menuhin's teacher at that time. and a mentor, and the Menuhins followed him around when he went back to Romania. They would go to Romania with him to be with Ionescu. Ionescu was a phenomenal musician, not just a great violinist, violin teacher. He was a great pianist and a great composer, as many of you will know. And his opera Oedipus was done recently in London. It's an extraordinary piece. So this connection between Ionescu and Fleck and the Menuhins was very rich. And Yehudi told me this story, and I'll come on to it later when we talk about the St. Paul's performance of the Sacred Service. So the reason Yehudi wanted to conduct it, he said to me, was the last time I heard the piece was at that time that Bloch played it at the piano. He'd never heard it performed after that. This is why he really wanted to conduct it. So in that period in 28, 29, 30, 31, they had a lot of contact. The violin concerto was written in 38, and Yehudi is clearly learning it in 1939. They meet in New York, the Menuhin family and Bloch, and that's when Yehudi made that recording of Aboda, and Yehudi says he's learning the concerto. He doesn't actually perform it until 57, I don't think, but he was learning it then. And then they don't see each other between 39 and 1954. So there's a long gap, obviously the Second World War. There was some correspondence, and I think Yehudi was performing in Portland, Oregon. There was some correspondence in 49, but they didn't meet then. And then in 54, when Yehudi's playing in Oregon, he goes to visit Bloch, and Bloch says that in his diaries and whatever, that it's lovely to see Menuhin again. He hadn't seen Menuhin since 1939. So there was clearly this very big gap. But then Menuhin picks up the violin concerto, and he plays it in Holland in 1957. He gives it a New York premiere in 57, and just before Bloch dies in March 59, he plays it in Israel, and it's his Israeli premiere. And as I'm sure as many of you know, Bloch actually never went to Israel, although there were many plans for him to go and for things for him to do. And before we come back to this time, Yehudi records it, as you'll see. I've put here significant performances after the death of Bloch. He records it in 1963, and it's a wonderful, wonderful recording. And I thought it would be nice to hear a little bit of the second movement, because it's just that bit that Yehudi was kind of singing in that interview. Hearing me actually play it is really beautiful. So we'll skip ahead of all of this. This is the program from that Israeli performance. There was Mozart, Bloch, Debussy, and Duka, and it was March the 5th, 1959 in Jerusalem. And this is the recording from 1963, a bit of the second movement. again, I'll have to stop it there because there's so much to talk about. But again, that recording's totally available. I mean, why is this amazing violin concerto neglected? I have no idea. In the last few years, the Korngold has become very trendy and everyone's discovered the Korngold concerto. But this is a wonderful, wonderful violin concerto. And that recording is just truly magical. So I hope that as we come up to the big anniversary, that we will certainly be able to get some of the best violinists around to learn that and perform it. It's a wonderful, wonderful piece, particularly that slow movement, which is where Yehudi always shines at his best in this lovely, lovely slow music. But he obviously really loved Bloch and loved his music, and that's just a really extraordinary recording. When Bartók was very ill in the 1940s, Yehudi had commissioned the solo, what became the solo sonata, which is one of the great, if not the greatest, solo violin piece of the 20th century. And he'd been a young man when he commissioned that in the 40s. He was in his early 20s, Yehudi, or mid-20s. And so he does the same thing with Bloch when it's quite clear that Bloch is really coming to the end of his life. He and Diana visited at Agate Beach in 1958. Diana was a force of nature and to be reckoned with. So I should think the Bloch household was turned upside down when she arrived with Yehudi. Anyway, and Yehudi Bloch finished the first suite in April, and I think, from what I can gather from the literature, Yehudi had offered so much money that Bloch thought he ought to give him a second suite. And so he then writes the second suite and finishes that in July. And the first suite has an interesting story because the premiere, Yehudi was supposed to be giving the premiere, but Alberto Lisi, who was always described himself as Menuhin's only violin student, which is not strictly true, but he was a wonderful Argentinian violinist who worked with Yehudi, studied somewhat with Yehudi. He was giving a big concert in the Wigmore Hall, his debut in the Wigmore Hall, and an Argentinian piece he was supposed to be premiering didn't turn up or wasn't written or whatever. Whatever had happened with the communications, this piece didn't appear. So Yehudi graciously said that he could learn the first suite. So Alberto, those of you in California, his son Antonino Lisi is head of strings, I think at UCLA or USC in Los Angeles. Tonino's a wonderful cellist. Alberto, the father, great violinist, gave the premiere of the first suite in the Wigmore Hall. As I said, Yehudi then in March played the concerto, and then Yehudi gave the premiere of the second suite on June the 5th, and Bloch died on July the 15th. So as I said, Yehudi, he was his first composer, and Yehudi was his last performer. Yehudi did record both suites, and he played both suites in Carnegie Hall. You'll see there in 1979. I discovered, some of you will know, Donald Weilerstein did wonderful, wonderful recordings of these suites, and I think his recordings are just really wonderful. I mean, I know Donald Weilerstein's a teacher. He teaches at the New England Conservatory. Some of the Menuhin School students went from the Menuhin School to study with him when they left the school. I never heard his violin playing, and discovering his recordings of the suites. So I'm going to play a little bit of the second suite with Donald Weilerstein playing it. And it's, again, why are these pieces neglected? I mean, at the Menuhin School, I heard virtually every piece in 19 years, every piece written for solo violin. Not a note of these suites. It's partly because my music stuff tended to come from the Russian tradition, and we got lots of music from the Russian tradition. But these two beautiful suites just should be played and played. And Weilerstein's performance particularly, I think, are very, very convincing. And that's what we should get here. I'm going to stop there because I have got another couple of musical examples, and I see that time is moving on. But again, Wildstein's recordings of the two suites are really superb. I mean, to be honest, they might not be the masterpieces that the Bartok solo sonata is, but they are very fine music, and I don't know why they're not in the repertoire. So now I come finally to our famous performance that Geraldine organised of the Sacred Service in St Paul's Cathedral. And once I was not going to be conducting it, Yehudi's office phoned up and said, well, he'd quite like to go through the piece with me because the last time he'd heard it was at that 1931 playthrough. So I went down to the Menuhin school. I think it might have been one of the little times when I wasn't teaching at the school. I can't remember. And we went through it with the pianist, and we went through it. And he told me that story that he told that you all saw at the beginning about him hearing it back in the early 1930s. And he said, Malcolm, why isn't there a dies irae? And I said, well, it is a Jewish sacred service. Why doesn't Bloch become angry with God? I said, I wish I'd had the courage in 1931 to say to him, why don't you write a movement which is, it's all moderato. Why can't we have a movement that's kind of like, he said, Malcolm, can't you write a piece and say a movement and say we've discovered this new movement? And I said, well, actually, a good friend of mine is Alexander Knapp, who's a Bloch scholar, and I think we'd get caught out if we tried to slip in a bit of music. Those of you who have read the Bloch studies, I mean, there's a good argument that the Bernstein Mass, and certainly the Bernstein Kaddish Symphony, is where a Jewish composer gets angry with God. Bloch doesn't get angry with God, but Bernstein certainly argues with God about faith and about religion. So that was when we were preparing it in 1995. That was Menuhin's criticism of the Sacred Service. We have some pictures of the occasion, which Judy, who's there, took. There's the program, and there's Suzanne outside St Paul's Cathedral, and there are two pictures of Yehudi. They're rehearsing the orchestra and choir. There's Yehudi and I in the crypt just before the performance, discussing the finer points of it, no doubt. I mean, it was a great occasion, and anyone who was there, and I think Robert Brody and Linda Brody, if they're still there, they were singing in that performance, and Judy, I think, was singing in that performance. Those who sang in it thought it was wonderful. The organist nearly died that day. I mean, St Paul's Cathedral has a 7-second echo, so you have to play 7 seconds before the beat. And Yehudi was famous for having a very, very bad beat. Very hard to follow. He was great at coaching orchestras, and he was wonderfully wise and everything, but actually being able to follow him. So it was actually a nightmare. But it all passed wonderfully, and it's passed into folklore as one of the great, great performances. And it was a very, very special day, no doubt about it. So Yehudi got to conduct the Sacred Service, and that performance was very, very, very special. I'm going to finish with a little bit of the young Yehudi playing with Persinger in 1929, playing Nigun, and then a little bit of the new generation, the young students now at the Menuhin School, playing Nigun. So let's hear a little bit of Persinger and Yehudi. Right, and I hope we've passed on that tradition to the current students. This was recorded just before lockdown in Sussex. I see that Kevin Lowe's joined us. Hello, Kevin. He's was a pupil at the Menuhin School. I think Nipakorn, who is known as Note, the soloist, I think she is from Singapore, but Kevin will tell me. But maybe not. Anyway, this is the school orchestra, young, talented musicians getting the tradition of how to play Bloch and how to love Bloch's music. It's in a big church in Sussex. Right, I'm going to cut off there to give you a chance to ask some questions and things. I just feel that the tradition of how to play Bloch is alive and well, and Yehudi's connections with him are passing on through the current teachers at the school. I'm no longer at the school, I'm retired from that, but a lot of my colleagues are still there, and we're passing on the tradition. And my successor conducted one of the Concerto Grossi with the orchestra, and I think there's the Menuhin Bloch link is a very, very strong one, and hopefully will continue. I think this picture must have been taken when at Ville d'Avray when that day when they were playing the Bloch Sacred Service. Yehudi looks about the right age. It looks like it might have been 1931. So thank you very much for being attentive. I will try to answer any questions, although there are other people much more expert than Bloch on this Zoom than me. So maybe I will pass it over to those who know more.
Malcolm, thank you. Thank you so very much. Fascinating presentation. Great examples that you shared with us. There are different ways that you can ask questions. You can put something into the chat, and you will then be called on. Or if you know how to raise your hand with that little hand-raising symbol, that's fine too. Or I think you can simply raise your hand literally, physically, in a way that is visible. I wonder if I could just start off with a first question, though, myself. Since we heard a certain amount of music by Bloch, with obviously strong Jewish associations, but performed in churches, I'm just wondering if you can comment on that a little bit. It reminded me that the first time I heard the sacred service, it was in a church in New York, an Episcopal church that is the principal American branch of the Anglican Communion. And well, just thinking about this last performance we just heard, and also thinking about Menuhin conducting the sacred service at St. Paul's Cathedral, is there anything counterintuitive here? Or is this part of a general ecumenical outlook, and these things happen in England all the time, that a Jewish violinist will conduct a Jewish sacred service composition in St. Paul's Cathedral? And what do people make of that conjunction of Christianity and Judaism?
Well, I'll kick off, and then others please do come in. So when we did the sacred service in York Minster, so it's 1980 was the 800th anniversary of the massacre of Jews at Clifford's Tower in York. So we had a weekend of events in York. This was a very, very special time. Someone came. 1990. 1990. It was 11/90/1990. That's right. And Zemmour is a mixture of people who are non-Jewish, who are a little bit Jewish, to people who are really quite Orthodox. And one or two objected to the fact that we were in York Minster and there were all these crosses there. And the dean, who was a great Hebrew scholar, knew a lot more Hebrew than me, he just said, oh, the cross is a pagan symbol, and went round and took all the crosses out of York Minster. He said, oh, you don't have to have a cross in a church, it's just a pagan symbol, you know. And for the Christians, or particularly some of those very scholarly Christians, the Old Testament is what Christianity should be looking towards, and they have no problem with having our sacred service in York Minster, and similarly at St. Paul's. St. Paul's had no problem. So the problem might be that Jews don't want to go into a church, but generally speaking, there's no problem that the church will have us in. I don't know, Judy, if you remember any more about that, because you were very involved in those performances.
Yeah. The two performances, the York and the St. Paul's, were held under the auspices of the Council of Christians and Jews. And so it was an ecumenical thing, bringing people together. Otherwise, I'm not quite sure how they would have managed it. But using that as the organization that under which it was being held was how we did it. And I think the Canterbury Cathedral were, I'm trying to remember, when we had the senator thing piece.
Kaddish for Teretz Inn, we did Kaddish for Teretz Inn.
Yes, that's right. that was also in conjunction with the Council of Christians and Jews.
Right.
Great, thank you. Are there any other questions or comments for Malcolm? Yes, Joshua Freelander.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm so exhilarated to hear that thing about the Red Indian. I was just like, wow. I was wondering where that was coming in the Suzanne Bloch source book, but that's what he wrote there in the Red Indian. But now that explains it all about, what he thought about the second movement, because it doesn't say specifically second movement. So because when I was reading it in the program notes, it said the second movement, Andante is curiously and quite unconsciously related to figure blah blah, because he's a figure here, and then starts with a kind of folk song of a very quiet and dreamy character. And then so when I read that, it didn't say anything about Red Indian, so I didn't use that for my treatise. But now it makes a lot of sense now, because of that missing video that happens.
I thought you'd like that.
Yeah, I loved it. I thought it was great, and I love his performance of the violin concerto. I've always did, and in my opinion, I thought that the way I did like was also how he presented his tempos, because it felt like there were the way he phrased and everything. It felt so organic, and so as a person, as a violinist myself, trying to understand some of the melodic things that are happening and the melodic gestures happening, I always felt that his performance really exemplified the violin concerto a little bit more than Szigeti's, in my opinion. But it's just because I just love Menuhin so much, and now I need to get the full box set sometime. But because I have the Heifetz, and I know there's a little Milstein there, but I just see him as one of the great masters of the 20th century, no doubt, as violinists. And I remember hearing some of these early recordings of Yehudi Menuhin. I don't think anybody can match his in that time, in my opinion, because I heard the Bazzini and I go, oh my God, that's just remarkable. So anyway, well, thank you for giving that information. Thank you very much.
He had quite a mother who made sure he played the violin rather well, but that's another seminar on Jewish mothers.
Alex Knapp, yes.
Yeah, just unmuting. First of all, thanks ever so much, Malcolm. That was wonderful to have those insights, and also to have such a personal kind of perspective on it. I think that really brings so many things to life. Your connection with Menuhin, Menuhin's connection with Bloch, all these generations kind of connecting up with each other. I think it's really excellent to have these links with the past that are so kind of direct and meaningful. There are, by the way, numerous recordings, interestingly, over the years of the Bloch Violin Concerto, LPs and indeed CDs. It's just that there are hardly any live performances or broadcasts. It's a shame that one doesn't hear it more, that it's not part of the standard repertoire, because I think it's a totally magnificent piece. I just wanted to come back, though, to the question of Bloch's music, liturgical music, shall we say, in the church. I think we ought to devote a whole session about Bloch and Christianity. I think this would be an interesting one, because Bloch had a very, very individual take on this. He wanted his sacred service not only to be performed in synagogues, but also in churches and in concert halls. He made that very, very clear in his own statements about the sacred service. So therefore, it's no surprise. I mean, doing the sacred service in St. Paul's Cathedral was absolutely part of, almost Bloch's message. He wanted this as a message to the whole of humanity. He didn't want it localized just for, shall we say, the Jewish community. Although it is interesting that it is actually the setting of the Reform liturgy of the Sabbath service, which Cantor Reuben Rinder actually discussed with him, and which he used. I think this idea of Menuhin's about having the dies irae, I think is magnificent. I never heard that one before. That is so fascinating.
That wonderful chapter in your Bloch studies about connecting it with the Bernstein Mass, although I'd probably connect it with the Bernstein Kaddish Symphony, more than that. Yeah, but yeah, I mean, Yehudi always had a twinkle in his eye, and he was always a little bit subversive, you know. And he just said to me, I wish I'd have said it." You know, I was a young teenager then. I wish I'd have had the courage to say it to Bloch back then. But there is a lot of moderato in Bloch. There's no two ways about it. He composes a lot of moderato, and in the sacred service, and he wanted some kind of allegro to really get his teeth into. But it's a wonderful work.
There
The
are
remote,
parts of it though that are very intense
yes. Oh, it's wonderful.
of the
And
sacred service.
yes, no, it's wonderful. But that was just what I remember very well from going through that.
I remember that Suzanne Bloch told me that she gave Leonard Bernstein a very hard time when he wanted to include the Kaddish in the sacred service performance that he was recording in place of the English text that Bloch himself wrote to take the place of the Kaddish in that very place, right there towards the end of the service.
He does that in his recording, and I hadn't realized it was so close, because then Robert Max and our predecessor, recorded the sacred service with Zemmel, Jeffrey Simon, in the 70s. So only a few years after the Bernstein, but the Zemmel recording with Jeffrey Simon, and was it the London Symphony Orchestra, I think, is what Bloch wrote. And as you say, Suzanne Bloch was very cross with Bernstein, because he was always trying to mess with things. I understand why he was, but that's not what Bloch intended. As you say, he wanted this universality, and he wanted that English prayer in English in the sacred service.
It connects up a little bit with. I'm sorry, I do want to hear what Joshua has to say, but just to while it's sort of relevant, and I know Frank is very interested in this side of things, and that's to do with the crucifix that Bloch had hanging in his house wherever he lived after 1906, which is when he was 26 years old, which is when he purchased it in Bern. And people have thought, well, so Bloch became a Christian. No, not true. But he did see that crucifix as a symbol of suffering humanity. And it made a very deep impact on him, this life-size sculpture. And so therefore, this idea of the connection between, Bloch's philosophy of life, which was not standard Judaism by any means, although he did say that the sacred service was a personal matter between him and God. This is a quote, and it's rather a striking quote, I think. Nevertheless, he did feel that Jesus was the only true Christian, and that the church had been a failure over the centuries. This was something that he actually is quoted as having said. Bloch was very outspoken, and he was very, very, very provocative in his statements. And it's very complex what his actual religious philosophy of life was. And I think this is something that needs to be perhaps attended to in much, much more detail than has been done so far. And it may make more sense then of Bloch's feeling about ecumenism, about universality, about spirituality, all these factors that were very much part of his life, but not in any conventional sense of organized religion, although he utilized organized religion as a vehicle, perhaps, for his own feelings and therefore also his music as well.
But just as an addenda to that, you see, I would say that was very much Yehudi's approach to Judaism as well. I would have thought Bloch would have shared very similar views, and Yehudi had his views from his parents. His father Moshe wrote a lot about these kinds of things, and I think they all shared this same rather ambivalent attitude to Judaism. Anyway, I will be quiet and let whoever was coming in.
Thank you. Joshua, I believe you had a question, yes.
Yeah, it was not a question, it was a statement. It was my feelings, this is my own opinion about it, is that I feel that Bloch's violin concerto wasn't picked up. It's pretty much how we feel about Bloch in general when we teach it. I mean, in general, if for myself, I mean, I only knew some of the Jewish works as a violinist. I never listened to his secular works. I wasn't never taught that. And I feel that's the way that it might be changing now, but the violin pedagogy, I look at violin pedagogy and I look at the influences of maybe Jascha Heifetz as, with the Erich Korngold as examples why maybe the Erich Korngold might have been really big and popular now than say the Ernest Bloch violin concerto. That's my only opinions, because as I've said and I've and I try to I like to promote the work, is because it is a really incredible work. It's really it's distinct. It's very specific. It really shows who Ernest Bloch is. And I think it's a very unique violin concerto. And also, it's a kind of hard to understand sometimes because he goes through all these different swings like Ernest Bloch does, which I love, and it just shows his humanity. So, yes,
Joshua, I don't know if Joshua Bell has played it, for example.
No,
but if someone,
not to my knowledge.
But if Joshua Bell played it or recorded it, then everyone would be playing it. We've only got to get one of the big names, or Nicola Benedetti in the UK, someone to play it, and then everyone will be playing it, because it's it's up there and worthy, as we all know. Anyway, I'm preaching converted here.
But that was my thought. I think it's because of how we are taught music, how we taught violin pedagogy, very specific on certain stylistics, and of course how I feel there's so much Heifetz influence. I mean, if I didn't hear the Poem Mystique by Jascha Heifetz, I'd probably not gone through my road to see the violin concerto. So that was my thought. Anyway.
Malcolm Miller.
I thank you so much again, echoing everyone's earlier comments, Malcolm, for that talk. I'm just recalling actually speaking to you about this topic in other contexts, when you actually mentioned, if I'm right, the memorial piece that you wrote for Yehudi Menuhin, where you actually quote Avodah.
Yes, the elegy.
Yes, and well, the point what I was gonna say is how
I felt
I'm
very
not sure you mentioned.
Yeah, I mentioned it very briefly. So there were the three pieces where I quote Avodah, and Yehudi's the elegy was written in one day. It had to be, because we were organizing a funeral in the school grounds, which was a very complex business, and I just felt that this was the last piece that was going to be played before he was buried, and it should have a quote from the first piece that was ever written for him in it. And it was played by one of our senior students magnificently, very, very moving. So that's the other place I quote Avodah.
Yeah, no, so I was thinking about the in general quotation of Avodah in like your other piece that we heard, this fantastic sort of where everyone's together playing different bits and the Bartok and everything. And so I'm just wondering, your own style is obviously influenced by, let's say, postmodern or modernist influences. I'm just wondering how what Menuhin would have, what was his view of that sort of contemporary style? Did he enjoy that sort of let's say post-Ligetian? Did he perform it?
He commissioned an awful lot of music down the years and he played a lot of new Israeli composers. He commissioned a lot of Israeli composers, and for his festival in Gstaad, he commissioned all sorts of people. I mean, more conservative, Frank Martin and these kind of people. But he was Yehudi was very pragmatic and practical. He just got on and made music, and if he was doing something somewhere, he was not. I mean, I remember he was asked to judge a composition competition, and I got a phone call from his secretary saying, "I wonder if you could come and help out, because Yehudi would quite like to know what you think about these pieces." So he didn't have time and didn't really want to sit down and go through all these scores, but he was very open to everything, and I mean, commissioning as a young man, commissioning Bartok in the early 1940s was a pretty outrageous thing to be doing. But he has certain composers who he loved, and Bloch and Bartok and Elgar were the kind of more contemporary of his era, the composers that he got to know and that he loved promoting. I mean, for him, the Beethoven Violin Concerto was the top of the Himalayas. That was his. But for him, Bloch, Bartok, were very important, and Elgar, obviously.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Alex, I believe you put your hand up again? Or is that your hand just staying up from the last time?
No. I did put it up again. I'm sorry to say. But it's just, there's so much talk and there were so many references to Avodah. in your talk, which is really fascinating. I'm just wondering how you feel about this. See, Avodah is a Jewish chant which is actually usually known as the HaKohanim, and it's from the Yom Kippur service. And it is a chant which is shown pretty much in its entirety in the Jewish Encyclopedia, right at the very beginning of the first volume, because it's of course AEB. And interestingly, Bloch took this melody and he actually copied it pretty well, note for note, from the Jewish Encyclopedia, and added a quite, how shall I say, I would say quite an unadventurous piano accompaniment. That's not a criticism. I'm just talking about stylistically, it's very much C minor. And, you know, one would imagine this was not in any way experimental at all. The violin part, of course, is a way of making the melody more violinistic. It goes much higher than any cantorial voice could ever go, and it's also not much faster, but much more elaborate in a violinist sort of sense. Bloch, after all, himself was a very highly trained and highly proficient violinist. That was his instrument. But my question is really, is the taking of a traditional tune and adding a harmonization and making a few changes to the melody what it actually means to be a Jewish composer? See, Bloch has been, many scholars and commentators have said there's nothing Jewish about Bloch. Even the great Abraham Idelson, who was the father of Jewish ethnomusicology, he said, no, there's nothing Jewish about Bloch, just a few augmented seconds here and there, and a kind of heavy melancholy. And that is Bloch's music. There's no reason why we should call it Jewish. Well, that's, I think, very unfair, because it's not true. There's lots of elements of traditional Jewish music material all over the place in Bloch's music. Next time, in a month's time, when we talk about the viola music, there'll be many examples to show how Bloch actually took many actual traditional Jewish music tunes and used them in his compositions. But my question is, to what extent is it the how shall I say, the ethos of the Jewish composer to take a melody and harmonize it, more or less as it stands?
Well, that raises a whole can of worms, several cans of worms. The first one is I have no problem with it at all. Some people would say, well, why should he get the royalties? Because it's not his music. That's a kind of financial. So whenever anyone does an arrangement in the various composers' organizations I belong to, everyone says, well, why should you get the royalties? You know, it's just you just arranged it. So that's a kind of slightly side issue. And in the church, you have an awful lot of, I mean, plain chant, which is modal, then has tonal accompaniment added to it, particularly in the French. So if you go to services in France when Notre Dame reopens or whatever, you hear this Boulanger, who was my other teacher, always used to talk about these weird mixtures of modality and tonality. But in fact, you get that in the Bach chorales. Bach takes Lutherian chorales, which are modal, and he adds tonal harmony. So from a musical point of view, if it's done nicely, then I don't have a problem with it, and I think Bloch does it beautifully. The fact he does it very simply is very sympathetic. He's not trying to be ornate. He's not trying to stamp his own authority on it much. He's just kind of sitting back as a composer and letting the music. He's writing it as an encore piece for this brilliant young violinist who plays Nigun like a dream. That's the kind of mentality he wants. He thinks, oh, I mean, I'm not averse to doing that myself, you know, because players want encore pieces, and if you take a traditional melody and you add an accompaniment, it can be a beautiful encore piece. So I think in the context, I think Avodah works beautifully, and I have no problem with it. But I know you say he does it in C minor, but he's actually very sensitively harmonized and very beautifully harmonized. And when you hear Yehudi playing it with Persinger, you know, it's a bit special, I would say. I understand your niggles and why you've got those niggles, and I can appreciate that about how one defines it. But as a musician rather than a musicologist, I'm not bothered.
I
Yes,
just want to
Alex.
emphasize that it was not intended as a criticism. It was intended as an observation and a question. And I'm curious really about it. And I love that piece. I think it's very, very beautiful. Interestingly, the Vahakoanim tune was also harmonized, quotation marks, by Louis Lewandowski, the great 19th century German synagogue composer. But he harmonized it basically in E flat major with the same notes exactly, but instead of in C minor plus, modulations, he harmonized it in E flat major with modulations, and the character and the atmosphere is quite different. It really is extraordinary. Mind you, he composed it as a setting for a cantor and organ accompaniment, whereas Bloch, of course, for violin and piano accompaniment. But nevertheless, it's just so interesting how different pieces can sound, even when the melody is almost the same.
But if you could put yourself in Bloch's mindset in 1928, here's this young boy playing a piece that was only written 5 years earlier, playing it the way any composer would love a piece to be played. I mean, Yehudi plays it like he's a cantor. I'm talking about Nigun. So he's going to want to write a piece for this young boy. And obviously he knows the parents and they're part of the same community. So you can see how and why it came about. It was kind of in the stars. No, sorry, someone else was about to come in and say something.
Can I just very quickly just say something from a sort of musicology angle, that what it might have meant, perhaps, I don't know what exactly whether he was aware, but there is a connection with the St. Petersburg school, isn't there, Alex? I was thinking that Achron and another violinist who composed and took melodies, and of course Joel Engel, they were taking the tunes. So Bloch, who had sort of said he wasn't an archaeologist and sort of wasn't using tunes, but it's maybe this was it how novel was it that he was actually taking a tune rather than not taking a tune, if you see what I mean? I mean, and how would he have been aware of the context of that St. Petersburg school, which was just sort of at that point quite prolific in arrangements, let's say, of traditional melodies as concert music.
Yeah, it's actually, if I may just jump in, just to say, as far as I know, I haven't done too much work in this, but as far as I know, it seems that Bloch did have some experience of the St. Petersburg school, because there were people, this was founded in 1906, obviously in St. Petersburg, some classically trained musicians, Jewish, who traveled around and picked up, collected musical materials from the folk traditions in Russia, and then in fact make them into art music, Western classical art music. They did travel as far as Geneva, which is where Bloch was living at the time, and gave concerts. And I believe there is some record as to Bloch having attended one or two of those concerts and being quite impressed, having a positive response to it. As to whether this was a normal activity for Bloch to take traditional tunes and harmonize them, well, he said that he never did that because he was not an archaeologist. He composed out of himself, Jewish music out of himself. But actually, if you look at the music itself, and also if you look at some of the other documentation, you find that actually it happened, I wouldn't say regularly, but fairly often, that he did actually take traditional Jewish musical material and not exactly harmonize it, but arrange it in a way that was, in keeping with his musical style. But nevertheless, you could always detect the traditional musical material there in the background, either in the background or indeed in the foreground.
But surely
there are many examples.
Surely the kind of music he would have learnt with his eye. There's lots of violin repertoire that takes melodies from other, existing melodies. The Last Rose of Summer, Ernst. This whole kind of post Paganini school of taking music that exists and doing things with it. I mean, I just commend Bloch for not doing too much with Avodah, just leaving it, not turning it into this flashy piece, but keeping it as this very spiritual piece in C minor. But there's a long tradition that he, as a violinist, he must have played lots of pieces that were based on other folk musics of other cultures. I would have thought.
Great. Thank you. Are there any other questions? Edison Fairbisk. Yes.
Okay. Hi, I speak in Portuguese and she translate.
Okay, good.
Queria falar sobre talvez uma hipótese paradoxal, né, sobre a obra de violino do Bloch não ser tão executada.
He wants to say something about a paradox about maybe why the Bloch works are neglected.
Menuhin contribuiu para a interpretação, né, da obra de Bloch. Acho que foi o que mais tocou, né? Pode falar sobre isso?
From one side, Menuhin was one of the violinists who plays more times and contributed to the for the Bloch works to be known all around the world.
Mas, ao mesmo tempo, ele criou uma própria linguagem interpretativa, né? A partir de Menuhin não se toca mais Bloch da mesma forma, né?
Since him, everyone should play as he used to play. It's a model of how you should play.
Também uma própria linguagem de virtuosismo sobre o violino, né? A obra de Bloch é o virtuosismo moderno, vamos dizer assim, né? No caráter interpretativo. Né?
And he created a language about a new kind of virtuose playing for the modern violinists.
De forma, os violinistas praticamente não se atrevem, isto fica intocável. Ninguém nunca vai tocar a Vodá como Menuhin. Isto é um paradoxo. Ainda não surgiu um violinista capaz de... Então tem que se partir... Este é o meu estudo da linguagem interpretativa. Eu penso que existe uma obra, Bloch Menuhin, é uma composição, o estudo musicológico é sobre isso, né?
Saying that he believes there is a language that Menuhin helps to create about Bloch works, and it's a special language that he almost as he composed the works and create a language that violinists should play also like him used to play. That's why sometimes some violinists choose not to play because to be compared as like Menuhin. I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's good.
Thank you very much. Yes. Malcolm, did you want to comment on any of that?
I think there's a lot of truth in that. I'm always perplexed as why Szigeti, for whom the concerto was written, didn't put it forward and perform it more. But that's another discussion, I think.
Yes. Well,
I agree. Following Menuhin, it's quite difficult.
As a non-violinist, as one of a number of non-violinists here in this group, I can stand to get some clarification on what you meant, Malcolm, when you were talking about how the Menuhin tradition is still alive and well at this school. What does it mean for someone to be playing the violin in that Menuhin tradition as opposed to someone who plays in some other tradition? Because my ears don't pick up on these subtleties.
That's at least a 3-hour seminar. It's being very, very physically relaxed at the instrument. So the instrument becomes like an extension of your voice. That's the first thing from a point of view in the playing. And a lot to do with how the bowing arm is your breath. I mean, playing the violin is singing for Yehudi, and that is how you work with the bowing arm. And he traveled around the world, and in my time there, we had several Russian teachers that had this way of teaching young children and setting them up physically at the instrument so that they play in a certain way. And Yehudi says somewhere that, you know, it's going to be people from the Far East is going to be the next generation. Actually, he was talking about the Jewish mothers have been replaced by the tiger mums, and this was going to be the next generation. So from a physical point of view, there's something about playing the violin, but also through the teachers at the school, through Dora Schwarzberg, who worked with Yehudi and who first played my version of Nigun. All the kids heard her play it, and she played it so much in the Menuhin tradition. There's very emotional, not shy to be emotional and spiritual. Heifetz always had this reputation for never playing a note out of tune in public, of being pristinely clear and almost in a kind of brittle way, whereas Menuhin always had this reputation for being much more spiritual in his music making. They're both great violinists, and you pays your money and you takes your choice. I'm just thankful that the world had both of them. But this is a big subject. But certainly there is a generation coming up that still understands that way of playing. I hope and think, and a lot of the teachers at the school who are in their 40s now are all still people who were pupils at the school and worked with Yehudi. So there's going to be another 30 or 40 years, I hope, of training in that school, which still links directly to Yehudi's tradition.
Good. Thank you. Thank you. Well, we're approaching the 2-hour mark. I guess we do have time for a couple of further questions. Judy and Robert, I see your hands are raised. Judy, did you have a question for Malcolm?
It's not actually a question, but I wasn't sure which photos you had. So just before the talk, I dug out a couple of pictures from the St. Paul's thing. And I don't know if this is the same one. I shall hold it up. This is one that I took, which I think might be the one you showed. And the other one, is this one, which is very sweet. So I just thought you'd enjoy seeing this.
Lovely.
Thank you.
Robert Brody has been waiting to ask a question.
Yes, Robert.
Yes, also a comment. It's so wonderful to share Malcolm's privilege. I don't think Malcolm will mind me saying it was a privilege for him to have that wonderful relationship with Yehudi Menuhin, but it's a privilege for us to have him share it with us. And so many other people here too have the privilege of being able to discuss in depth these great names. I remember the concert at St. Paul's Cathedral with Yehudi Menuhin conducting the Bloch sacred service. It was a fantastic, wonderful occasion that I remember very well. Musically, we did suffer from that 7-second echo. It didn't help, but it was a wonderful occasion and something wonderful to remember. But Linda here too will, I'm sure, join me in that. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you all again. If there are no further questions, I wanted to make sure you all have on your calendars the next 2 scheduled events. So Wednesday, June 9th, we'll be hearing from our own Alex Knapp and Rivka Golani to discuss Bloch and the viola. Stay tuned for further details and a description of that event. And then our last scheduled Bloch presentation of this current season is going to be July 14th, when Myron Silverstein will be talking about the piano sonata of Ernest Bloch, and both obviously extremely fascinating subjects that will be addressed. Thank you all so much. Yes, was there one final point, Malcolm? Yes.
I just put in the chat that link that you were talking about at the beginning.
Yes.
The previous talks, if people want to look at them.
Yes. So that link in the chat, you should all copy, paste it, bookmark it. That will take you to the YouTube channel of, I always forget the complete title of it, the International Jewish Music Studies Group, I think. And that is where you will find a recording of this particular presentation by Malcolm and all the others in this same series. Thank you so much. Great to see you all. And again, Malcolm, thank you very, very kindly.
My pleasure. See you all next month. Bye.